Paul uses the body metaphor to explain the reality of what he has experienced. The gospel accounts that come along later, if one just pays attention to the detail, everybody abandons Jesus. Nobody watches him die. So in Mark, there are no appearance stories at the end. The parable that Mark refers to, actually it's a misnomer to call them empty tomb stories. There's always somebody there. When the women go to the tomb in the Mark, the neoniskos is there. There's a young person. And the message is, if you're looking for Jesus, basically you're in the wrong place. He's not here. He's back in Galilee. He's risen. He's alive back in Galilee. So you have to be very careful about how you read that. The successive stories then express that truth differently. In Matthew, you have the angel that literally rolls the tomb away. In Luke, you got, behold, two figures are here, probably like Moses and Elijah from the Transfiguration. Every writer, every teller of the truth of this imagines it and pictures it differently. There's no, irreducible core that lies behind these.
I'd like to come back on part of what you said on the point about Paul not mentioning the empty tomb. This kind of argument from silence, I think, is extremely tenuous. For example, if certain Corinthians hadn't been abusing the Lord's table so that Paul was required to reprimand them, we would have no reference in Paul's extant literature to the Lord's Supper. And there would probably be modern theologians who would say, well, Pauline churches didn't celebrate the Lord's Supper. But because the historical accident that these Corinthians were getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, we have a reprimand for Paul, and so we know he knew about it. Now, in the case of the empty tomb, as I said, I think that Paul implies the empty tomb in two ways in 1 Corinthians 15. First of all, in saying, and he was buried, and he was raised, in the mind of a first century Jew implies that the grave was vacant. No first century Jew would have thought in saying, and he was buried, and he was raised, but the corpse still lay in the tomb. Secondly, when he says he was raised on the third day, we need to ask ourselves, where did this third day motif come from? And very briefly summarized, I think, of all of the different explanations, the most plausible one is that this is theologically charged language for the date of the discovery of the empty tomb by the women on the third day following the crucifixion, so that it is a time indicator pointing to the empty tomb. And when you compare this four-line formula in 1 Corinthians 15 to the gospel narratives on the one hand and the sermons and the Acts of the Apostles on the other, that four-line formula is just like an outline, like a skeletal outline of the narratives of the crucifixion, the burial by Joseph, the discovery of the empty tomb, and then the appearances. So I think you have in Paul implicit the empty tomb.
Dr. Borg?
I was say I'm not sure of the rules here. Can I ask them a question?
You should.
All right, great. To either of you or both of you, it's a two-part question, and I hope the answer to the first part is real quick so you can get to the second part, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm wondering in what state you think the resurrected body of Jesus exists. I mean, would you say it's a physical body? Would you speak of it as transformed physicality? That's the first question. Okay. The second question is, do you think he still exists in that same state?
Very good questions. The language of resurrection doesn't use the language of body because it uses the language raised from the dead. The Greek phrase is ek nekron, out of death. So we have a resurrection into some kind of a state. Before we get, and I'm answering your second question, before we get to 1 Corinthians 15, we have 1 Corinthians 6, in which there's a discussion about committing immorality with the body. And Paul makes the argument in that chapter that it does matter what you do with your body. It matters an awful lot what you do with your body, because your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and he's looking forward to the day when you will be raised just as Jesus was raised. So my answer is this. You have a transformed body that still has an element of physicality in it. Okay, that's the point. Actually, the contrast in 1 Corinthians 15 is not between physical body and spiritual body. The actual language of the contrast is between soulish body and spiritual body. That's an important difference because the English translations mess that up. And in the process, Suki-kun. And so what we are talking about is a body that emerges transformed that still has some element of continuity and connection to what the body
I have no problem.
was.
But physicality, transformed physicality, I mean, is that...
Yes, because what we're talking about is a clothing now that takes on immortality. That's also the language of the Pauline text, 2 Corinthians 5, etc.
And I have a follow-on question, but do you have anything to add to
Well,
Daryl's?
I know that this is a question, Marcus, that you've raised before and that troubles you, and I wonder what you would think of this, because this is a philosophical, not a New Testament type question.
It's a question of the imagination, too. But,
what would you think about this? Why couldn't a person say that in his risen state, Jesus of Nazareth has a human nature, and that when he is present in this four-dimensional space-time manifold, that human nature manifests itself in a physical body. But when Jesus exits this four-dimensional space-time manifold, that physical body isn't manifested in any way, it doesn't appear. And an analogy would be like a tuning fork, which when it's plucked, you hear the sounds from the vibrations. If you put that vibrating tuning fork in a vacuum jar, it's still vibrating, but it won't manifest itself in the form of any sound. Now, why couldn't you say something like that with respect to the human nature of Christ?
Would you be happy with this way of putting what you just said? That the risen Christ, when not present in this four-dimensional space-time manifold, I'm trying to use your language here, that the risen Christ, when not visible here, then exists in a non-physical kind of way, but sometimes manifests as a presence that can be seen, even touched in this world.
Like in the resurrection appearances.
Yeah, I mean, but is that a fair paraphrase back?
I think so. That's what I'm suggesting. Okay. Why wouldn't that be a plausible view?
That's fine with me. I got no problem with that at all.
Okay.
But I don't think that's a physical body.
Well, yeah, because when Christ is present here, then it's manifested as a physical body that has a weight, extendedness, materiality, and so
you
forth.
could weigh the risen Christ manifesting himself?
Excuse me?
You could weigh the risen Christ manifesting himself? I think you said he has weight.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
even today.
Daryl Schmidt, in his video on the resurrection, talks about how in these appearances Jesus eats fish in front of the disciples. And Daryl says at that point, this is too weird for me. I mean, it's very clear that this is a physical body that you know, except... So, why not think of it that way? That seems to me to make sense.
Except that at the same time it, moves through doors, walls, it appears, it disappears.
Yeah.
This is not the language of how you and I eat.
Right, and we all agree that the resurrection isn't the resuscitation of a corpse. We all agree that this is a transformation into what Paul called a glorious, powerful, immortal resurrection body.
Let me step in real quickly and let us, if we can, raise the house lights, and we will give some of you a chance to ask a question. If you want to line up with those two microphones, we will do so. While that is happening, let me just have one question for Dr. Board and Dr. Schmidt, assuming I don't lose my control here. One of the things that I heard Dr. Craig speak to is the unusual accounts that the empty tomb was discovered by the women. Dr. Bach talked about the seed, the historical starting point, that there was nothing in the Jewish context of resurrection. Either Dr. Board or Dr. Schmidt, what do you make of those interesting anomalies, if indeed these are metaphors?
The recent scholarship that I read talks a lot about the tradition, both in the Jewish world and in the Roman world, of women naturally go to look for the buried one in order to perform the rituals that are associated with burial. So if one is looking for testimony in court, that's a different sort of thing. But if you're going to describe a story in which you picture somebody looking for the dead on the third day, that is as much describing the custom that happens in the culture of the time, and it is clearly a role that women fulfill as part of the burial custom of the culture.
To which I would add very simply, and I don't know this at all, this is just speculation, but it could reflect the historical fact that the first appearances of the risen Christ were experienced by women. I mean, I'm agreeing with what Darrell said and adding that.
The one common figure is Mary Magdalene, and
Your
she's
face was
always
turned
there.
away, and I can't hear you.
I said it could also reflect the historical fact that it's possible that the first appearances of the risen Christ were to women, that the first people to experience the risen Christ were women followers.
We may be moving closer to one another.
But I don't think the tomb was empty. But
Well, the question is, where were they going to?
I'm just saying that the fact that they are the first witnesses to the resurrection could very well mean women were the first to experience